I don't know what made me cry more. The song that our praise team just shared with us, or Pastor Tandy's family moment. But I suppose it would be good for me to stretch myself, so what the heck? Before we dive into today's sermon, I just want to remind us that today is the last Sunday in our 3-week stewardship campaign here at Life Journey. As I shared with you a couple weeks ago, in recent months, we've been running on average about $1,280 per week below our budget, and if that were to continue, we would reach a point where we'd have to significantly draw back on some of our activities as a church. So during this stewardship campaign, we're trying to close that gap. I saw an interesting public service announcement on television a couple weeks ago from a group called disasterrelief.org. And the point of this PSA was, when there's a global disaster, let's say in Bangladesh, we can't all pick up and physically go there and help, but our money can. And then the PSA showed these little dollar bills folded up like cut out paper people who were running to the disaster. That made an impression on me because it makes the point that we can't be everywhere, but our money can do things that even we can't. It's the same here with our church. Last week I shared with you how we as a congregation were able to underwrite the costs of critical spinal surgery for Philip Stargate, who leads this incredible prophetic ministry in East and South Africa called Crossing Lines Africa. And by helping him heal up and continue to lead that transformational organization there, they're striving to raise up in East and South Africa churches like ours, churches that preach the gospel of peace and practice the radical inclusivity that we see in Jesus Christ in the Gospels. It's a transformational ministry that has the potential to change churches in Africa, change culture in Africa, change a continent, and you start to change the world. We can't all be, none of us can physically be in Uganda, but our money is there making a difference. And it's also the same right here at home. This past Wednesday afternoon, Robin Herman, who's a longtime member of our congregation, came by the church with her beloved dog Skeeter, who has been diagnosed with leukemia, and the vet says probably only has about 6 months left to live. And so Robin came by on Tuesday afternoon with Skeeter for prayer for Skeeter and for her. And so me and a couple of our staff members who were here came into the sanctuary with them and up here to the altar, and we formed a circle around Skeeter and laid hands on her and prayed for Skeeter and for Robin as they navigate through this tough time, for God's grace and mercy and blessings to be with them. And Skeeter loved it, all the attention, all the pets. He's still in good spirits. Robin, for her part, Robin cried. Here's Skeeter, by the way. Robin cried, and at the end of the prayer, Robin said just how much it means to her and has meant to her throughout the years to have a church family that surrounds her with love and prayer in times of great crisis. None of you could be here on Tuesday afternoon, but because of your giving, some of us could be here. Millions of beautiful moments like that are made possible because of our generosity. Thank you. Thank you all who've been able to respond so far to the stewardship campaign. We are making good progress. We've closed about half the gap so far, but that still leaves me thinking about, how can we close the other half of the gap? And then this week I had a brilliant idea. Well, you can be the judge of that, but here's my idea. It occurred to me that we could sell naming rights to the church building like sports teams do with their stadiums, right? So, for example, we could become Lucas Oil Church. Doesn't that have a nice ring to it? Or better yet, we could become Cool Ranch Doritos Church. Our motto could be, where the cool people go to church. Okay, so maybe that's not such a great... I got another brilliant idea. I'm like channeling Pastor Tandy. Her favorite thing to say is, I've got an idea. So I've got another brilliant idea. I heard a story how long ago when Oral Roberts was trying to raise money for his university, he went up into a tower and refused to come back down until they raised the money. So I could go up on the roof of our church building and refuse to come back down until we close the gap. But then it occurred to me that you would probably leave me up there. So, all gimmicks aside, let me simply say, if you're not yet a regular giver to this church, but you are excited about what God is and can do through churches like this, would you please consider becoming a regular giver at any level? And if you're already a regular giver, would you please consider whether you're at a place in your life right now where you could grow that generosity, where you could stretch your giving a little bit in any amount. The response form for those in the sanctuary is stapled to your Sunday headlines. And for those online, or for those who prefer an electronic response form, you can go to lifejourney.church/links, stewardship forms. Jesus said, freely you have received, freely give. Together with God, we can still do great things. But now, let's draw a line there and turn our attention to today's scripture and sermon, starting with a prayer. God, your word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. Life is crazy and it's hectic, but your scriptures are filled with wisdom for how we can tame the craziness and the hecticness of life. We need that wisdom. So today, open our hearts to the amazing truth waiting to be found in Psalms 3 and 4. We need it. Speak to us, God. We ask in the name of Jesus. Amen. When in your life have you felt most overwhelmed? In your life right now, what is it that most threatens to overwhelm you? Maybe there's somebody here today who is struggling with a troubled marriage, or maybe struggling with a child who's facing great difficulties. Maybe somebody here today is experiencing financial stress, or you're in a job that you hate and it's making you crazy. Or maybe you're here today with serious medical problems, or like Robin, maybe you've got a beloved pet that is seriously ill. Maybe you are here today feeling overwhelmed by a chronic addiction, or by anxiety, or debilitating depression. Maybe you are worried about what's going to happen in the upcoming elections and to democracy and to our world. Or maybe what keeps you awake at night is the Indianapolis Colts quarterback controversy and what's going to happen there. What is it in your life right now that threatens to keep you awake at night? The author of Psalms 3 and 4, King David, understood exactly what that feels like. In fact, he penned the words of Psalms 3 and 4 at a time when he himself was in great distress. We normally think of King David's reign as being very successful, and in fact, it was. But there came a time in David's reign when everything was coming apart at the seams. It's a long and tangled story. The backstory began years before when David's eldest son, Amnon, brutally raped his half-sister Tamar. In revenge, David's second eldest son, Absalom, murdered Amnon and then fled into exile. Eventually, David was persuaded to pardon Absalom and bring him back home again. But when Absalom gets back home again, now the eldest surviving son of David, he is disappointed to discover that David favors for his heir Absalom's brother by a different mother, Solomon. And so apparently Absalom decided to take matters into his own hands, organized and led a rebellion against his own father David. A rebellion that was so successful, it drove David out of the palace, out of Jerusalem, into the wilderness, from the palace to sleeping on the hard floor of caves in the wilderness, not knowing if he was going to live or die, being chased down by his son. And for several months, Absalom actually ruled, while David was on the run, until he could regroup and reclaim his throne. It was during those months when David was in the wilderness that he sat down and he penned these words, Psalm 3:1. "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising up against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God." In a sense, every one of us is David running from Absalom. By which I mean, every one of us are facing something in our lives that threatens to put us on the run. There's somebody here in our congregation today who has become the primary caregiver for her very sick elderly mother, and that is so overwhelming. There is somebody here today, you're in a job that you hate and you can't find your way out of it, and it feels so overwhelming. There is somebody who's here today who is struggling to stay sober, and it feels so overwhelming. Somebody who's here today who's battling with cancer, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. And if you let your mind dwell on it, it becomes overwhelming. We are all, in some sense, David on the run from Absalom. A little boy and his grandpa went on a vacation camping trip together. They arrived at their destination after dark and needed to carry all their gear from the vehicle through the forest to their rustic cabin. They made several trips from the vehicle to the cabin, depositing their gear on the front porch of the cabin. As they made their way to and from through the forest, they found they were surrounded by bugs and mosquitoes that they had to shoo away everywhere. When they finally got all their gear on the front porch, Grandpa said to his grandson, "Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to open the door to the cabin, leave the lights out, and quickly get all our gear inside, close the door, and then we'll turn on the lights so the bugs don't get in." So that's what they did. They hurried everything inside, lights out. But before they could get it all inside, close the door, and turn on the lights, the little grandson noticed that several fireflies had made their way into the cabin. The little boy turns to his grandpa and says, "Grandpa, it's no use. Now the mosquitoes are coming after us with flashlights." You ever feel like that? All around you are these forces, these overwhelming forces, and they've got flashlights. King David knew what that felt like. And so we would expect, as we read Psalms 3 and 4, that we would find these two chapters, these two Psalms, filled with words of despair. But instead, we encounter exactly the opposite. Instead, we encounter King David saying things like Psalm 3:3, "You, O Lord, are the lifter up of my head. Picture somebody whose head is down in despair, but somebody else walks up to them and gently lifts their chin, looks them in the eye, and says, we'll get through this together. Oh Lord, you are the lifter up of my head. David goes on from there to say in Psalm 4:1, you, O Lord, have enlarged me when I was in distress. That conjures in my mind the image of the Incredible Hulk and the Incredible Hulk movies where mild-mannered, weakling scientist Bruce Banner is suddenly transformed into the Incredible Hulk with superhuman strength. The promise of this passage is that in times of great distress, God enlarges us. We discover in those times, if we're open to it, if we partner with God in this, we discover that we have more strength than we ever thought we had in us. You're probably familiar elsewhere in Psalm where it says in Psalm 18:29, by you, O Lord, I have run through a troop, and by my God, I have leaped over a wall. Picture yourself running right through a squadron of enemy soldiers untouched, and then leaping in a single bound over a tall wall to a place of safety. What is it we used to say about Superman? Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to jump over tall buildings in a single bound. The promise here is that there is a Superman, there is a Superwoman, there is a super person inside of you waiting to be discovered through the power of the Spirit of God in you in our times when we feel most overwhelmed. So David goes on to say in Psalm 3:5, in the midst of all of this chaos in his life, I laid down and slept. Even though it was the cold, hard floor of a cave, I laid down and I slept. I will not be afraid of 10,000 people who set themselves up against me, round about. Picture yourself sleeping like a baby when you are surrounded by 10,000 foes. That is the promise of God. That in our times of greatest distress, God, if we will partner with God, is willing to lift up our head, enable us to sleep like a baby in the presence of our enemies. God, in those times, stands ready to enlarge us like the Incredible Hulk and give us the strength to run through an enemy troop and leap over tall walls in a single bound. Who wouldn't want that? Give me some of that. How do we get in our life what David had in his? As I pondered these two Psalms in recent weeks, I was struck by the fact that there are two very specific, powerful, and practical things that David tells us to do in these two Psalms, which, if replicated in our life, will enable us, like David, to triumph through the times of overwhelming chaos in our lives. Two key things. The first of those two key things is found in Psalm 4:5, where David says, in the midst of turbulence and chaos in your life, offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. I'm intrigued by that phrase, sacrifices of righteousness. It's kind of an old-fashioned sounding phrase, but I found myself wondering, okay, what exactly does that mean? Well, think about it. Righteousness means doing the right thing. And sacrifice means doing something that is costly. So offering sacrifices of righteousness means doing the right thing even when it's costly. It means refusing to compromise my ethics even if that means I lose my job. It means refraining from lashing out at somebody who's out to get me, up against me, and attacking me unfairly because I believe it's the right thing to do, not to lash out. Sacrifices of righteousness mean that I help somebody who needs it, even when I'm dog-tired and worn out because it's the right thing to do. It means that when the pressure is on, all of the stressors of life are crashing in upon me, instead of yielding to the impulse to do the easy thing, I instead resolutely choose to do the hard thing, the right thing. And you'd think that that would just make things worse. You'd think that that would just add to our stress. But the irony, when we do what is right, we sleep a whole lot better. It actually brings peace into our ordeal rather than draining peace out of it. Consider an example. Years ago, maybe 12 years ago now, David and I were on vacation at the beach in North Carolina. Back then, every year, my entire extended family would gather for a week of fun in the sun at Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina. So this particular year, as we were at the beach, about halfway through the week, one night as we were all gathering for dinner, all of a sudden, my dad lost consciousness, toppled over, and banged his head against the ground, unconscious. We had no idea what was going on. We dialed 911. He was rushed to the hospital, to the ICU. When he hit the ground, it turns out it created a brain bleed, but thankfully they were able to contain that. But they couldn't figure out what's making him go unconscious. He'd had several episodes like that in recent months. And so that meant he had to stay in the ICU overnight for observation and evaluation to try to figure out what was going on with him. My mom at that point in time was midway into Alzheimer's. Dad was obviously distressed, a little bit disoriented, feeling very vulnerable. Mom insisted that she was going to stay there with Dad in the ICU, but she was in no condition to do that. He would have had to take care of her instead of the other way around. The last thing in the world I wanted to do on my vacation, on my beautiful beach vacation, was to spend the night in the ICU at that God-forsaken hospital. But I knew if I didn't do it, my mom would insist on doing it. Plus, Dad really needed it. He was feeling very vulnerable. So I convinced my mom to go home with my two sisters. And I said, I promise you, Mom, I'll stay here with Dad. This particular ICU had no furnishings in the room because they didn't want to encourage people to stay. So there was nothing to sit on, nothing to lay on. The nurse brought some blankets and some sheets in, and I put them down on the cold linoleum floor and laid down to try to get some sleep, wondering what kind of germs am I rolling around in on that hospital floor. Meanwhile, my dad is in his bed, and as the night unfolds, just as I'm about to drift off to sleep, he wakes up, he's disoriented, I have to help him, get him calmed down, and then as I'm about to drift off to sleep again, all of a sudden he has this urgent sense he's got to pee, but he's not supposed to get out of bed, and so I've got to help him get his legs out around the bed and find the plastic urinal and help him pee, and all night long, this, that, and the other. By the next morning, I'm completely exhausted. It took till midday the next day for a diagnosis, which was that he was having long pauses in his heart rhythm, which would cause his blood pressure to drop, and he would faint. So he needed a pacemaker, but they couldn't do that till the next day. To make a long story short, 3 of the longest days of my life, the whole second half of my precious beach vacation, I was stuck in that hospital, sleeping on the floor in the same old clothes, unable to shower, having to watch what Dad wanted to watch on TV, and he's hard of hearing. He turns it up really, really loud and blasts you out. It was, you might say, 3 days of hell. But you know what? Looking back, I would have to say that those 3 days were one of the top 10 most meaningful things I've ever done in my life. Because when my dad really needed me, I was able to be there for him. That's beautiful. That's meaningful. I wouldn't trade those 3 days for anything. I'll bet you have found the same thing in your life. I'll bet that some of the hardest things you've ever had to do, when you did the right thing and it was hard, I'll bet those very things bring incredible meaning and beauty into your life. I love the way psychologist Susan David puts it in one of her TED Talks. She tells about how she's constantly meeting people in her life, counseling people in her life who want a happy, fluffy life. And when they encounter hardship in life, their attitude is, something's wrong. Life is not supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She says, when I encounter and I counsel people like that, she says, this is what I say to them. She says, I say to them, quote, you have dead people's goals. Only dead people never get stressed, never get broken hearts, never experience the disappointment that comes with failure. Tough emotions are part of our contract with life. You don't get to have a meaningful career or raise a family or leave the world a better place without stress and discomfort. Key statement. Discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. I was on vacation. I was supposed to be sitting on the beach with Snoop Dogg, sipping Coronas and watching the waves come in, because that's how I roll. Instead, I'm trapped in the ICU in some godforsaken hospital. And ironically, in the process, I would have to say I'll probably never have a better vacation in my entire life. Because so much meaning and so much beauty was infused into that very tough moment. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness. It's counterintuitive. In times of stress, we want to run from. No, do the right thing, and you'll find so much peace. Maybe you are struggling with a troubled marriage, and trying to fix it is so painful. But you will never regret trying to fix it, because even if it doesn't work out, at least for the rest of your life, you will have the peace and the satisfaction of knowing that you did your best. When the heat is on, when the pressure is great, when you're at risk of losing yourself, when the stress is about to break you, when you're tempted to do the easy thing and compromise your values or your integrity, don't do it. Offer sacrifices of righteousness. Do the right thing even when it's costly, and you will have peace. Even if it's chaos all around you, you will have peace, and you'll be able to sleep at night. But there is one other thing, a second thing, that I see David doing in Psalms 3 and 4 that may be even more critical than this first point. David goes on to say that in times of great stress, he counsels us to, in the words of Psalm 4:4, commune with your heart upon your bed and be still. That echoes, of course, another even more famous verse in the book of Psalms, Psalm 46:10, where God says, be still and know that I am God. There's something powerful and beautiful in that phrase, right? Be still. Be still. And when we hear that phrase, we tend to think that what it means is rest. We tend to think that what it means is find a quiet place and meditate and center yourself. Get out of all of the noise, take a bubble bath, and sip a glass of wine. That's what we tend to think. That this is counseling us to find a quiet place in our life. Now, don't get me wrong. The Bible affirmatively commends Sabbath rest to us. Self-care in times of crisis, very important. It's a good thing to do. But that is not what these two verses mean. These two verses, when they say be still, are not talking about our outer environment, whether it's quiet or chaotic, but rather these two verses are talking about what's happening inside of us. You can be a nurse frantically running from patient to patient and still in real time be practicing what it means to be still. You can be in the midst of a civil war in your family, everybody shouting and tension all around you, and still in real time practice what it means to be still. You can be on the battlefront in a war with ammo bursting around you and still in real time practice what it means to be still and know, because being still has nothing to do with what's going on around you and everything to do with what's going on inside. The Hebrew word translated as be still in Psalm 46:10 is spelled M-A-M-A-R, pronounced pronounced Moam. I'm not getting the pronunciation now. Anyway, it's not mamar. Moi, mom. Okay, there it is. It came to me. Moi, mom, spelled M-A-M, or excuse me, that's because I'm saying it wrong. It's dwa, mom. There we go. D-A-M-A-M, dwa, mom. I read an article, a deep word study on dwa, mom, on christianwalls.com that revolutionized my understanding of what be still means in these two verses. The Hebrew word that is translated means to cease your inner striving. Dwamam is the opposite of being all stirred up inside. It means to surrender the illusion that you have the power to control ultimate outcomes in life. It's a call to stop resisting and resenting that what is happening is not what was supposed to be. It's a call to embrace what is. Don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean we sit on our behinds and do nothing. As we've already seen in the first point that David makes, we should do even the hard thing. We should do what we can to make bad situations better. But the second point is, even as we do that, we have to accept that we are not ultimately in control. Relinquish control. That is one of life's most important lessons. You will never have peace until you learn that lesson. 95% of our distress in life comes from failing to internalize this simple lesson. When I find myself in times of trouble, you know the words, sing it with me. Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom. What does she say? Let it be. And in my hour of darkness, she is standing right in front of me, speaking words of wisdom. Let it be. 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 Whisper words of wisdom, let it be. You know how you feel when you sing that song? That's what Dwamam means. Let it be. It's a funny thing, when this song first came out when I was a kid, it's a Paul McCartney song, you probably know. When this song first came out, in the church I was being raised in, it was a forbidden song. Not just because the Beatles were singing it, but because it mentions Mother Mary. And I was in a fundamentalist Baptist church, and we were very suspicious of how those of you who are Catholic adore Mother Mary. And so we didn't want to touch this song with a 10-foot pole lest we be sucked into Catholic heresy, right? And so this was always a forbidden song for me. But even as a kid, hearing this song, I sensed the spiritual power of what was being said here. But of course, we fundamentalist Baptists, we were right and everybody else was wrong. It reminds me of, have you heard that old joke about a guy dies and he ends up in heaven, and St. Peter says, let me give you an orientation tour of the heavenly city. And so they walk around to this neighborhood, this is where the Lutherans live, and the next neighborhood, this is where the Methodists live, and this neighborhood, the Catholics are here and over here. This is the Pentecostal neighborhood. And then after they've toured all the neighborhoods of the heavenly city, they walk out the Golden Gates on this long road way out into the countryside till they come to this isolated enclave, a little village. St. Peter says to the man, and this is where the Baptists live. The man says, why in the world do they live clear out? Shh, St. Peter said. Be quiet. They think they're the only ones here. That's how I was raised. And part of how we protected ourselves is we never sang this song. But you know what? Our Catholic friends were right in this sense. We should adore Mary because Mother Mary is an incredible example of what Dwa Mom means. By the way, I don't know if you know the backstory to this song, but Mother Mary was originally meant to refer to Paul McCartney's mother, who died when he was a teenager, and in his distress, she came to him in a dream and said, "Let it be. It's going to be okay." And John Lennon didn't want them to sing this song because Lennon was anti-religious, and Lennon foresaw that everybody would interpret this as being about Mother Mary, Jesus, Mother. But McCartney insisted, and so Lennon insisted that the next song on the album be one of his more profane songs to sort of counter this really. So it's an interesting song, but ever since, everybody's, of course, understood this as being a reference to Mother Mary, the mother of Jesus, and I think that's a good thing because her life is the perfect example of what we are talking about today, what King David is recommending to us. Think of it. When she was just a teenager, Mary encountered the angel of the Lord who told her that before she could even marry Joseph, she would be found with child, a child that was not from Joseph. You can imagine how that turned everything upside down. This is not what was supposed to be. You are ruining all of my plans, God. What am I going to do? Talk about being overwhelmed. Not just that, but then Simeon, the prophet, tells Mary that the child that she bears will end up suffering greatly and ultimately being killed, and that therefore she too will suffer greatly. This is not what any mother wants for her children, that they would suffer and die. God, this is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not how I had my life planned. You are messing up everything. That's what Mary could have said. She could have been all stirred up inside. She could have been all frustrated. She could have been all agitated. This is wrong, wrong, wrong. Instead, Luke tells us her response is, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. May it be with me according to your word." She lets it be. And as a result of that, she ends up living one of the most meaningful, beautiful lives in all of history. Let it be. And her son, Jesus, ends up living the same way. Wonder where he learned that. When he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the power of all of his foes are closing in on him. In the garden, Jesus prays and says, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." In other words, Jesus tells God exactly what he hopes, what he wants will happen in this situation. Let this cup pass from me. And he sweats, as it were, great drops of blood. Jesus in the garden, facing this overwhelming situation, he pours out his heart to God, and he tells God exactly what he wants to happen. That's a good thing. The Bible recommends that we do that. Pour your heart out to God. Tell God what you hope, what you want to happen. That's good, but Jesus did not stop his prayer there. He said, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me," and then goes on to say, "Yet not what I want, but what you want." Because Jesus understood that if what God wants is different than what he wanted, Jesus would rather have what God wanted, because Jesus knew that what God wanted would be better in the greater scheme of things. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is practicing Dwamam. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he's embracing what is instead of resisting and resenting it. And he does the right thing, even though it's the hard thing. He goes to the cross. And because Jesus practiced Dwamam, he went on to live the most beautiful and the most meaningful life ever. Do you want to triumph through overwhelming situations in your life? Do what Jesus did. Do what Mother Mary did. Do what King David did. 2 simple points that can help us enormously. Offer sacrifices of righteousness. Do the right thing even when it's costly. And cease your inner striving. Embrace what is instead of what was supposed to be. Let me close with this. Speaking of my dad, several years after the story I just told you, my mom descended into the latter stages of Alzheimer's, and so Mom and Dad had to sell their home in the mountains of Colorado and move back home to Indiana. They ended up building a house right next to my sister, north of Zionsville, out in the countryside. My mom, by that point, had become so disabled by her Alzheimer's, she was almost completely homebound, not entirely, but almost. And therefore, my dad, as her primary caregiver, was also almost completely homebound. When I was out sitting at the kitchen table one evening, Mom was just kind of there. We just finished dinner. And after dinner, Dad puts his head down and said some of the saddest words I've ever heard him speak. He said to me, "It wasn't supposed to be this way. This was supposed to be the time in life when your mom and I would travel the world and have fun together." And because my dad doesn't have a very well-developed spiritual dimension, he wasn't able to appreciate that even in this twist of fate, there was still great beauty and meaning to be found. He was so frustrated. He was so agitated. I mean, he cared for Mom with great care. But inside of himself, he was always resenting and resisting that their life had come to this. It's so unfair. So that he couldn't allow himself to say, "It's a beautiful day outside. Let's just go for a walk." We can still do that. He couldn't allow himself to say, "Wow, this food we just ate was amazing. Thank you, God." He couldn't allow himself to say, "Wow, that game I just watched on TV, it's going to be a classic." He was so stirred up inside. So, in those 5 years of his life, the most meaningful and beautiful 5 years of his life, when he was caring for my mom like she had cared for us all those years, he wasn't able to appreciate that beauty because he was so caught up in the frustration of the moment. Don't let that happen to you. We are not in control. If we don't learn that lesson, we will live a life of great distress. Most distress in life comes from that. So, remind yourself, I'm not in control. I surrender my illusion that I have the power to determine ultimate outcomes in my life. I leave that to God. I will embrace what is. Do that and feel the peace and the serenity flooding into your soul. Domam. Let it